Frank Capra. If anyone believed filmmakers should have the final say, it was him. He wasn't just a director for hire, he genuinely thought the artist should be in charge. In the mid-1930s, while he was making Lost Horizon for Harry Cohn's Columbia Pictures, which came out in 1937, later, studio recollections and Capra biographies say the cut was changed without his approval, and he pushed back directly at Cohn. Then, in 1946, he went even further and, according to some film historians, filed a claim saying his earlier work had been used in what was released as a song to remember. For Hollywood back then, that was bold, arguing with studio money and still staying Frank Capra. He proved that when your name sells pictures, you can demand control, and sometimes even get it from Columbia. But it's one thing when a famous director fights the studio, and a very different thing when an actress tries to break out of a long studio contract. Elizabeth Taylor. She used to call the old system a factory, and still, she didn't work only for MGM. On paper, she was tied to them from the early 1940s right up to about 1960, but, as some of her contemporaries said, she could push through outside projects just on the strength of her name. That's how she did A Place in the Sun at Paramount in 1951 and Giant at Warner Brothers. In 1956, both movies touched subjects that were slippery for that era: marriage for status, relationships across social lines, hints at intimacy. In Notes and Pieces published later, it shows MGM wasn't thrilled about her working around the studio. But by the mid-1950s, you didn't pick a fight with Elizabeth Taylor, the audience was coming for her. She proved it the practical way. Once the public picks a face, the studio can't dictate every line anymore. To see just how far that control could go, let's look at another star who said no straight to the studio boss. Joan Crawford. Over at Columbia, there was one tough boss, Harry Cohn, and a lot of stories followed him. In variety columns and later in memoirs, he was described as the man who, in the 1940s and 1950s, could make or break a woman's career inside that studio. Most actresses didn't tell him no, he decided whether you worked or sat at home, but Joan Crawford wasn't the scared type. In retellings that weren't backed by paperwork, people said that when Cohn crossed the line, she calmly reminded him she was having lunch the next day with his wife and kids. Cool, polite, and very clear. That's a rebellion too, not in court, but right there in the office, telling no to the man who signs your checks. But that wasn't the only time a Columbia actress decided her private life was none of the studio's business. Kim Novak was the face of Columbia in the mid-1950s, and she still did things her way. In 1954 to 55, when the studio started pushing her hard after those early romantic roles, there's a story that they wanted to make her name more Hollywood, but she insisted on keeping Novak. That was her saying, "I decide." Then in 1957 to 58, when she began spending time with Sammy Davis Junior, a black entertainer, Columbia, according to people who remembered the final Harry Cohn years, reacted hard. Connections like that could hurt box office and her studio star image. Hollywood back then didn't want to show interracial relationships, not even off-screen. But Novak, refusing to disown it publicly, was a statement. An actress doesn't have to live by the studio's racial or marriage rules. It was quiet, but everyone saw it. She pushed back against the version of her life the studio wanted to sell. But long before that, the same studio had another star who also refused to be convenient for Harry Cohn: Rita Hayworth. She was brought into the studio in the late 1930s by her then-husband Edward Judson, but she refused to sleep with the boss. Harry Cohn expected that a promising beauty would have to. She didn't. And he didn't fire her only because, after Gilda came out in 1946, audiences adored her, and Columbia was making real money off her name. Instead, there's a version that he started pressing her in small ways: fines for not cooperating, notes about her call times. People even mentioned bugs in the dressing room. But Rita never turned into the easy-to-manage kind. She proved the hardest thing. You can stay a box office star and still not give in to the boss's personal demands. And then, there was another star from that same era who had to defend not a role, but her own private life: Judy Garland. Today, everyone knows she endured brutal conditions at MGM, pills to stay slim, strict diets, and even sleep control. Starting back in the late 1930s after The Wizard of Oz, 1939, made her a star. But even under that control, she tried to protect her own life. In 1941, at just 19, she fell in love and married musician David Rose. At the studio and at home, the reaction was cold. In private letters, people explained it this way: "The public still sees her as a little girl. It's too soon. She married anyway." It wasn't rebellion in court, it was rebellion at home, a quiet, "I'm not your product." To audiences, she remained the girl from Oz. In life, she was fighting to be treated like an adult. What happens when an actress doesn't just say no, but actually leaves for Europe, knowing the studio will come after her? Bette Davis was one of the few who did exactly that. In the mid-1930s, Warner Brothers, with Jack Warner in charge, kept handing her throwaway parts. Even though after Of Human Bondage, 1934, it was obvious she could carry heavy, complicated roles. She asked for better scripts and better pay. They said no. So in 1936, she went to England to make the kind of pictures she wanted. Warner Brothers hit back with a lawsuit in a London court, and she lost. But what stayed in Hollywood's memory wasn't the loss. It was the fact that a major actress openly fought her own studio over the quality of roles. After that, people at Warner talked to Bette Davis a lot more carefully. And the next star proved you could fight for your freedom over something as simple as a pair of pants. Katharine Hepburn. Sometimes rebellion looked almost funny. A studio telling a woman she couldn't wear slacks on set. Hepburn didn't find it funny. In the mid-1930s, when she was working at RKO, she kept showing up in trousers. Then, according to biographers, the wardrobe people made them disappear to force her into a skirt. So she calmly walked around the studio in her underwear until they gave the pants back. That was her message. You can control the shooting schedule, not how I look. Back then, women were told how long the sleeves should be and even what pose to use for photos. Hepburn showed that a star could decide that for herself, and the studio swallowed it. What if the stubborn one isn't the actress in pants, but the studio's leading heartthrob? Tyrone Power got tired of being the pretty face on the poster at 20th Century Fox. In 1947, he picked Nightmare Alley for himself, not a light adventure, but a dark story about a carnival con man. Daryl Zanuck flat out told him a role like that could ruin his image with female audiences. Power pushed anyway. The movie came out, and, as later columns noted, the studio practically pretended it wasn't theirs, almost no promotion, no real push in theaters. For a star at his level, that looked a lot like punishment, and when he turned down Lydia Bailey in 1952, they just put him on suspension. That was an open clash. The actor wanted grown-up parts, the studio wanted safe money, and Power chose to take the hit. And the next star didn't argue over a part, she argued with the contract system itself. Olivia de Havilland dealt the studio system its hardest blow. At Warner Brothers, under Jack Warner, there was a handy trick. If an actor refused a role and got put on the shelf, that idle time was simply tacked onto the contract. So a 7-year deal quietly turned into 7 plus whatever we decide. In 1943, de Havilland said no. She took it to a California court, and in 1944 the Court of Appeal, in de Havilland versus Warner Brothers Pictures, sided with her. The press later called it the 7-year rule. 7 years means 7 calendar years, not an endless leash for the studio. She didn't just free herself, she cut that trick off for everyone who came after. Now you tell us, who took the bigger risk? The ones who spent a year fighting the studio in court, or the ones who said no to a man who could end their career with one phone call? Drop a comment with the names you'd add to this list, especially the ones the studios tried to erase.